So now that you've studied how comparative biochemistry, analyzing molecules such as DNA and proteins, can show us how closely related organisms are to each other, let's take a look at what other fields of science are saying about evolution. Paleontology is the study of fossils. Fossils can reveal changes in the characteristics between organisms. By analyzing the physical characteristics of these fossils, we can determine how closely related certain organisms are to each other, just like we did with my family members. Depending on which rock layers they can be found in, you can determine how old they are relative to each other. We can also take a look at, under the right conditions, how long ago these fossils were deposited. But not everything turns into a fossil when it dies. The figure on the top left is a picture of trace fossils. Trace fossils are any traces or signs that a living organism once existed there. They include footprints and even bite patterns. The picture below is that of a T-Rex. This is what we call a body fossil. It's a physical remain of a body part that gives us insight on what this extinct species looked like before our time. The one on the top right is that of a trilobite, and the one on the bottom is a body fossil of a mosquito that was trapped by tree sap and solidified in amber. By analyzing the ancient fossil remains of horses, we can determine that the leg bones and the teeth bones of horses have changed over time. The fossils that are located in the bottom of the rock layers are the oldest, and the ones at the very top are the most recent. When we analyze body structures between organisms, we are studying something called homologous structures. Homologous structures are anatomical structures such as bones and organs that have similar shapes and sizes. So what does this all mean? These common body structures show us that organisms have common ancestors. Homologous structures are clear signs of relatedness. Just as I have the same eye color as my brother does, and other traits in common, that shows that we share a recent common ancestor. Whether we're looking at the 5 fingers within the flippers of a whale, or the fingers of a horse, or anything in between, such as a hippopotamus, a rhinoceros, an elephant, a cat, or even your dog, we're studying something called a pentadactyl limb, meaning it has 5 finger bones. We call this adaptive radiation or divergent evolution because each of these organisms diverged from a common ancestor. So while in every organism in this picture, the pentadactyl limb serves a different function, the structure itself in the hand bones is very similar across all organisms. So you might ask, how do multiple species radiate from a single species? Well, closely related species that live in different environments may become different in appearance as their environmental pressures select for certain traits. In this particular example that we'll study more in depth later, the environmental pressure happens to be the food source. If we take a look at all 7 species of seagulls that surround the Arctic Circle, we can analyze their beaks, the shape of their wings, and their coloration, and all the other homologous structures to determine that they all share a common ancestor. We can do the same thing with placental mammals and marsupials. Every single one of the placental mammals shares some common traits with each other, so they diverged from a single common ancestor. Same thing with the Australian marsupials. They all share common traits, which means that they diverged from a single ancestor as well. This diagram shows us how some scientists believe marsupials evolved from ancestors of placental mammals over time. At one point, placental mammals got stranded on an island. Because they are separated by a physical barrier, in this case an ocean, the population stranded on the island becomes sexually isolated to the point where they cannot reproduce with the original species A on the mainland. This species B is somehow thrown onto an adjacent islands by storms, tsunamis, etc., and diverges into a third species. So even if the new species C returns to the first island, it has lost the ability to reproduce with B, and therefore is its own species. Another field of science that points to evolution is called vestigial structures. Vestigial structures are non-functional traits that are passed on from common ancestors. They're still present in the organisms because it's located in their DNA, but they're non-functional. They don't actually serve a purpose anymore. Some examples in humans include an appendix. We don't use it to digest anything like cows do, or a tailbone. We don't use a tail to balance ourselves because we're upright. Well, another really cool one are ear muscles. In other organisms, such as monkeys, apes, they need to be able to turn and twist their ears to detect prey or to detect predators. Well, in humans, we don't need to do that, but we still have those ear muscles because it's coded for in our DNA. We just don't use them. So what does this mean? It simply means that we share a common ancestor with these other species that have ear muscles. Another field of science that points to evolution is called comparative embryology. Embryos of related species share similar traits in stages of early development. This means that when we compare embryos between different organisms, we can tell that we share a common ancestor. So let's take a look at some embryos. Each of the figures on the top are embryos of different organisms. And if we look at the embryos of each of these organisms, we can tell that there's tons and tons of different similarities. In the early stages of development, we all look very similar to each other. So whether you're looking at a fish, a salamander, a turtle, a chicken, a pig, a lamb, a rabbit, or a human, we all look very similar in the early stages of life. By looking at the very earliest stage of development, can you tell which one's the human embryo? We can tell by looking below that it's the very right one. But if I didn't show you the later stages in development, just the top ones, then you would assume that they all have a common ancestor. So comparative embryology is just another physical piece of evidence that shows us that we're all related on the evolutionary tree.